On May 5, 1945, just 3 days before the war in Europe officially ended, something happened that had never occurred before and would never happen again. American soldiers and German soldiers fought side by side. Not as prisoners. Not under duress. But as allies, defending a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps against a force of Waffen-SS troops determined to kill everyone inside. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, the strangest battle of World War II. A battle where former enemies became brothers in arms. Where French prisoners picked up rifles and fought alongside their rescuers. Where a Wehrmacht major gave his life to save a French politician. And where a tennis star vaulted castle walls and ran through enemy lines to summon help. It sounds like fiction. Like something from a Hollywood movie. But every word of it is true. This is what happened in those final chaotic days of the war, when the old rules no longer applied and desperate men made choices that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Castle Itter sits on a hill in the Tyrol region of Austria, near the village of Itter. It had been built centuries ago, though the current structure dates to 1878. Before the war, it had been a private residence and then a hotel. A peaceful place in the beautiful Austrian Alps. But in 1940, after Germany annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss, the Nazi government took control of the castle. For a few years, it sat unused. Then in February 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, acting on orders from Heinrich Himmler himself, seized the castle completely. By April 25th of that year, Castle Itter had been transformed into a prison. But this wasn't like other Nazi prisons. It wasn't a concentration camp or a death camp. Castle Itter was something different. It was designated as a prison for what the Nazis called Ehrenhäftlinge, which translates to honor prisoners or VIP prisoners. These were people too important to simply kill, too valuable as potential hostages or bargaining chips. People whose names carried weight. The castle was placed under the administration of Dachau concentration camp, which was about 90 miles away. Prisoners from Dachau, mostly Eastern Europeans, were brought to Castle Itter to work as servants and maintenance staff. But the main prisoners, the VIPs, were French. 2 former prime ministers of France were held there. Édouard Daladier, who had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, trying to appease Hitler, and Paul Reynaud, who had consistently opposed Germany and had been prime minister when France fell in 1940. These 2 men had been political rivals, sometimes bitter enemies. Now they were cellmates. There were generals. Maxime Weygand, who had been commander-in-chief of the French army in 1940 when Germany invaded. Maurice Gamelin, who had also commanded French forces during the German advance. Both men had failed to stop the Nazi blitzkrieg, and now they were prisoners of the regime they'd fought against. Léon Jouot was there, a trade union leader and labor activist. François de la Roque, a right-wing political leader who had also been active in the French resistance. And perhaps most famously, there was Jean Barotra, a tennis star from the 1920s and 1930s, one of the greatest players in the world before the war. There was also Marie-Agnes Caillaux, the older sister of General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France. Her presence at Castle Itter was meant to give the Nazis leverage over de Gaulle. The prisoners lived in what had been hotel rooms, converted into cells. They had adequate food. They were allowed to walk within the castle grounds. Compared to other Nazi prisoners, their conditions were tolerable. But they were still prisoners, still under guard by SS troops from the notorious Death's Head Brigade, the Totenkopfverband, known throughout Europe for their brutality. And as 1945 arrived and Germany began losing the war rapidly, the prisoners at Castle Itter grew increasingly afraid. What would happen to them when the end came? Would the SS guards simply execute them all before fleeing? By early May 1945, the war was clearly over. Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th. Mussolini had been killed by Italian partisans days earlier. American and Soviet forces had linked up in Germany. What remained of the German government under Admiral Karl Donitz was preparing to surrender. German soldiers everywhere were either trying to surrender to the Allies or, in the case of the most fanatical, looking for enemies and traitors to kill in a final act of violent loyalty. On May 2, 1945, something happened at Castle Itter that terrified the prisoners. Eduard Weiter, the former commandant of Dachau concentration camp, had fled to the castle as Dachau was being liberated by American forces. He died at the castle under suspicious circumstances. The prisoners believed he'd been murdered or had committed suicide. That same day, Sebastian Wimmer, the SS officer in charge of guarding Castle Itter, made a decision. The war was lost. The Allies were close. Wimmer wasn't going to wait around to be captured or killed. He gathered his guards and they abandoned their posts. They just left. The prisoners were now free, technically. The gates weren't locked. But freedom was an illusion. They were still in Nazi-controlled territory. Waffen-SS units were roaming the countryside, killing anyone they considered a deserter, a defeatist, or an enemy. If the VIP prisoners tried to leave and ran into an SS patrol, they'd be shot on sight. Worse, the prisoners had learned that elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division had been ordered to come to Castle Itter and execute all the prisoners. Time was running out. The prisoners knew they needed help. They needed protection until proper Allied forces could secure the area. So they sent out messengers. The first was Zvonimir Kakovic, a Yugoslav handyman who'd been working at the castle. On May 3rd, he left the castle, supposedly on an errand, but actually heading out to find American troops. The nearest town was Wurgel, about 8 kilometers down the mountain, but German forces still occupied it. So Kakovic pressed on toward Innsbruck, 64 kilometers away. Late that evening, he reached the outskirts of Innsbruck and encountered American soldiers from the 409th Infantry Regiment of the 103rd Infantry Division. He told them about the prisoners at Castle Itter, about the danger they faced. Major John Kramers of the 142nd Infantry Regiment dispatched a heavily armed rescue force at dawn the next day. But the rescue force ran into problems. Heavy shelling stopped them just past Jenbach, about halfway to Castle Itter. Then Kramers received orders to pull back. Castle Itter was outside his area of responsibility. It was in the zone assigned to the 36th Division. He couldn't just go operating in another unit's territory, even on a rescue mission. The rescue force was recalled. Only 2 jeeps with auxiliary personnel continued on. But they wouldn't be enough to defend the castle if the SS attacked. Back at Castle Itter, when Kakovic didn't return, the prisoners decided to send another messenger. This time it was Andreas Krobot, the cook at the castle. He left on May 4th, heading for Wurgel. And that's when something remarkable happened. Something that would change everything. In Wurgel, there was a small Wehrmacht detachment. These were regular German army soldiers, not SS. And their commander was a man named Major Joseph Gangl, known as Sepp. Sepp Gangl was 36 years old, a career soldier who'd fought for Germany throughout the war. But by May 1945, Gangl had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime. He'd seen the atrocities. He'd watched the fanaticism destroy his country. He'd had enough. Gangl had made contact with the Austrian resistance. He and his men were actively working to undermine the Nazis in whatever small ways they could. When Andreas Krobot found him and told him about the prisoners at Castle Itter, about the danger they were in from the approaching SS, Gangl immediately wanted to help. But he had a problem. He had only 10 to 20 men under his command. That wouldn't be enough to defend the castle against 100 or more SS troops. He needed the Americans. So Sepp Gangl grabbed a white flag, got in a vehicle, and drove toward the nearest American forces. It was an incredible risk. He was a German officer approaching American troops in the final days of the war. They could have shot him on sight, assumed he was trying some kind of trick. Instead, he found Captain John C. Lee, Jr., known as Jack Lee. Jack Lee was 27 years old, a hard-drinking, cigar-smoking tank commander from the 23rd Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division. He'd been fighting his way across Europe and was waiting to be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division when Gangl approached under his white flag. Gangl explained the situation. French VIPs held at a castle. SS troops coming to kill them. A desperate need for help. Lee didn't hesitate. He immediately volunteered to mount a rescue mission. He got approval from his headquarters and started organizing his forces. Lee and Gangl did a reconnaissance mission together, sneaking to the castle to assess the situation. When they returned, Lee gathered his men. He had 14 American soldiers. Gangl had 10 German Wehrmacht troops. They had 3 Sherman tanks, including Lee's own tank, which had a name painted on its side, Besotten Jenny. And they had 1 truck. It wasn't much of a force to defend a castle against a determined SS attack. But it would have to do. On the afternoon of May 4th, Lee's small force set out for Castle Itter. Along the way, they had to leave some of the tanks behind. The roads were in terrible condition, damaged by years of war. Infrastructure had collapsed. By the time they reached the castle, Lee had only one tank left. Besotten Jenny. When they arrived at Castle Itter, the French prisoners greeted them warmly. But they were also shocked and disappointed. This was their rescue force. About 30 men, Americans and Germans, and a single tank? Lee explained the situation. He didn't have enough vehicles to evacuate everyone immediately. And even if he did, moving a group of elderly politicians and generals through SS-controlled territory would be suicide. The plan was to defend the castle and wait for reinforcements to secure the area. The prisoners were told to stay safe inside the castle, to let the soldiers handle the fighting. The prisoners refused. They went to the castle armory, which still had rifles and submachine guns left behind by the guards. They armed themselves. Former generals and prime ministers and a tennis star, picking up weapons, ready to fight. There was another defender too. An SS officer named Kurt Siegfried Schrader, a Hauptsturmführer. Schrader had been wounded earlier in the war and had convalesced at Castle Itter. He'd gotten to know the prisoners during his recovery. And like Gangel, Schrader had become disillusioned with Nazi ideology. When the guards abandoned the castle, the prisoners had asked Schrader to take charge of their defense. He agreed. He brought his family to the castle for protection and prepared to fight against his fellow SS troops. Schrader would become one of the only known cases in the entire war of an active Waffen-SS officer fighting on the Allied side. Lee positioned his men around the castle. He set up defensive positions at key points. He parked Besotten Jenny, his Sherman tank, right at the main entrance of the castle, using it as a barrier and a source of heavy firepower. American soldiers, Wehrmacht troops, an SS defector, and armed French politicians prepared for the attack they knew was coming. The castle sat on high ground with open fields in front of it. It was made of stone, strong enough to repel small arms fire. There were multiple fallback positions inside if attackers breached the outer defenses. Lee dubbed the strongest interior position the keep. As night fell on May 4th, this strange alliance of former enemies waited. And just after midnight, they got their first taste of what was coming. An SS reconnaissance force probed the castle defenses, testing for weaknesses, assessing the strength of the defenders. The defenders fought them off. But everyone knew it was just the beginning. May 5, 1945 dawned clear and bright. And that morning, between 100 and 150 Waffen-SS troops emerged from the woods surrounding Castle Itter. They were well armed, with trucks, rifles, machine guns, and an 88mm anti-tank gun, one of the most feared weapons of the war. The SS opened fire. The battle for Castle Itter had begun. The defenders fired back. American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops fought side by side. Jack Lee directed the defense, shouting orders, moving men to where they were needed most. Besotten Jenny, the Sherman tank at the gate, provided heavy machine gun fire, keeping the SS from charging the entrance. The French prisoners, despite their age, despite having been told to stay safe, fought alongside the soldiers. Paul Reynaud, the former prime minister, wielded a rifle. Maurice Gamelin, the 72-year-old general, took up a weapon. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, moved with the athleticism that had made him famous, firing at SS positions. The 88mm gun boomed. Shells slammed into the castle, blasting chunks out of the stone walls. One shell hit Besotten Jenny. The Sherman tank, which had been the anchor of the defense, was destroyed. Suddenly, the defenders had lost their heaviest weapon and their best protection at the main gate. The SS pressed their attack. They had superior numbers and heavier weapons. The defenders were running low on ammunition. Every burst of fire depleted their dwindling supplies. If help didn't arrive soon, the castle would fall. Inside, the radio operator worked frantically to repair the tank's communications equipment and call for reinforcements. He managed to contact the 142nd Infantry Regiment and relay their desperate situation. The 142nd immediately dispatched a relief force. But they were still miles away. The defenders had to hold on. Sepp Gangel moved through the castle, directing fire, repositioning men, keeping morale up. At one point, he saw former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud standing near a window, exposed to SS sniper fire. Gangel rushed over to pull Reynaud to safety. An SS sniper's bullet caught Gangel in the head. He died instantly. The German major who had defected, who had sought out the Americans, who had led his men to fight against the SS, gave his life saving a French politician. By early afternoon, the situation was critical. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The SS were preparing for a final assault that the defenders wouldn't be able to stop. That's when Jean Barotra made an incredible offer. The tennis star volunteered to vault over the castle wall and run through the SS lines to reach the 142nd Infantry Regiment Relief Force and guide them back. It was an insane plan. The SS surrounded the castle. Running through their positions would be suicide. But Barotra insisted. He was 46 years old but still athletic, still fast. And he'd rather die trying to save everyone than wait to be overrun. Jack Lee accepted the offer. What choice did he have? Jean Barotra climbed the castle wall, vaulted over it with the grace of the athlete he'd once been, and ran. He ran through fields under fire. He dodged between trees and rocks. SS troops spotted him and shot at him. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. But somehow, miraculously, Barotra made it through unscathed. He found the relief force from the 142nd Infantry Regiment and told them the defenders were out of ammunition and nearly overrun. The Americans had to hurry. Barotra borrowed a uniform and a rifle and joined the relief force as they raced toward the castle. Around 4 p.m., the 142nd Infantry Regiment arrived at Castle Itter with tanks and fresh troops. They smashed through the SS positions, driving them back, overwhelming them with superior firepower. The SS broke and ran. Around 100 SS troops were taken prisoner. The battle for Castle Itter was over. The defenders had held long enough. They'd accomplished the impossible. And they'd suffered only one casualty. Sepp Gangel, the German major who'd become an Austrian hero. In the aftermath, Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. He'd led one of the strangest military operations in history and succeeded against incredible odds. Sepp Gangel was honored as an Austrian national hero. A street near Wurgel was named after him, Joseph Gangel Strasse. Today, there's a memorial plaque in the town commemorating his sacrifice. He'd been a German soldier who chose honor and humanity over blind loyalty in the final days of the war, and he paid for that choice with his life. The French prisoners were liberated safely. All of them survived. They'd armed themselves and fought for their own freedom, refusing to be passive victims. In the years after the war, many of them would play important roles in rebuilding France. Just 3 days after the battle, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over. The battle for Castle Itter had been one of the very last battles fought in the European theater. And certainly the strangest. The story of Castle Itter raises profound questions about war, loyalty, and humanity. Here were German soldiers, who'd fought for years under the Nazi flag, making a conscious choice in the final days to fight against the SS, to protect people their government considered enemies. What changed in Sepp Gangel's mind? What made him decide that saving French prisoners was worth defying his own side? We can't know for certain. He died before he could tell his story in his own words. But we know he'd seen enough of Nazi atrocities, enough of the fanaticism and cruelty, to know it was wrong. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS officer, made a similar choice. He'd been part of the Waffen-SS, one of the most ideologically committed Nazi organizations. But something in him rejected what the SS had become by 1945. He chose to protect the prisoners he'd befriended rather than follow orders to kill them. These weren't perfect men. They'd served the Nazi regime. They'd fought in Hitler's wars. But in the end, they chose humanity over ideology. They chose to do the right thing, even though it meant turning against their own comrades. Jack Lee and his American soldiers didn't hesitate to fight alongside Germans. In any other circumstance, these men would have been trying to kill each other. But when Gangel approached under a white flag, when he explained the situation, Lee saw past uniforms and flags to the basic human problem. People needed help. He could provide it. The choice was simple. The French prisoners, Elderly men who'd been political enemies before the war fought side by side. Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, rivals who'd blamed each other for France's fall, stood together on the castle walls with rifles in their hands. For a few hours on May 5, 1945, old hatreds and divisions didn't matter. Nationality didn't matter. Political ideology didn't matter. What mattered was survival and doing what was right. The battle for Castle Itter remains unique in World War II history. There was one other instance of Americans and Germans fighting together, an operation called Operation Cowboy, where they rescued horses from Soviet capture, but Castle Itter was the only time they fought a pitched battle as allies against a common enemy. It was the only known time an active member of the Waffen-SS fought on the Allied side. It was one of the last battles of the European War, and it involved a cast of characters so unlikely, a situation so improbable, that if you saw it in a movie you'd think it was too far-fetched to be believable. But it happened. Every bit of it is true. Today, Castle Itter is privately owned and not open to the public. But it stands as a monument to that strange day when the rules of war were briefly suspended, when enemies became allies, and when a group of desperate men proved that humanity can triumph even in the darkest circumstances. There are memorials in the area. The street named for Sepp Gangl. Plaques commemorating the battle. Historians and military enthusiasts make pilgrimages to see the castle where Americans and Germans fought together. In 2014, the historian Stephen Harding published a book called The Last Battle, chronicling the events at Castle Itter in detail. The book became a bestseller, introducing the story to millions of people who'd never heard of this remarkable battle. The story has been featured in documentaries and articles. Military academies study it as an example of unconventional warfare and improvised alliances. It's taught as a lesson in courage, in thinking beyond rigid categories of friend and enemy, in doing what's right even when orders and ideology say otherwise. The battle for Castle Itter reminds us that war is complicated. That people are complicated. That even in the worst circumstances, even when nations and ideologies clash violently, individual human beings can make choices that transcend the hatred and division. Sepp Gangl didn't have to seek out the Americans. He could have stayed in Wurgel, kept his head down, waited for the war to end. Instead, he drove toward American lines under a white flag and volunteered to fight against his own side to save people he'd never met. Jack Lee didn't have to accept the mission. He was waiting to be relieved. The war was nearly over. He could have told Gangl it wasn't his problem, that Castle Itter was outside his area of responsibility. Instead, he grabbed his men and his tank and drove into danger. The French prisoners didn't have to fight. They were elderly politicians and generals, not soldiers. They could have stayed in the cellar as ordered. Instead, they picked up rifles and stood on the walls alongside the men who'd come to rescue them. Each of these choices was made in a moment, a split-second decision that changed everything. And together, those choices created one of the most remarkable stories of World War II. The Strangest Battle. The day enemies became allies. The last fight in a war that had torn Europe apart. The battle for Castle Itter stands as proof that even in war, even when everything pushes toward violence and hatred, human decency can still break through. Sepp Gangl died a hero. The French prisoners went home to help rebuild their nation. Jack Lee went home to America with a medal and a story almost too incredible to tell. And Castle Itter stands still, on its hill in Austria, a silent witness to the day everything changed. 3 days later, the war ended, and the world could begin to heal. But for those who were there on May 5, 1945, the memory remained forever. The memory of fighting beside men who'd been enemies. The memory of defending a castle in the Alps. The memory of the strangest battle of World War II.